else. Like, when the simple arithmetic that he alluded to was on at school, they must have been on holidays because they failed to add up and subtract. We've got the best farmers in the world, and they're doing everything to destroy it. I'll tell you why. There's the original copy of Agenda 21 that Maurice Strong wrote. Now, Maurice Strong went to China so as he couldn't be extradited back for treason. There's our Agenda 21, completely different to that one. But what's the frightening factor of Agenda 21? Across the top of that, this is not for circulation. So what have they got in it that they're frightened of? Why do we have to sign these things? Why have we got to do it? And it's under the disguise of global warming. But it wasn't global warming for a start, if you remember, it was carbon dioxide tax. CO2. You're allowed to pollute as long as you'll pay for it. But we're going to save the planet, but if you want to start in China or somewhere else and pollute, and you pay us money, you can still keep going. So I asked a genius one time that would come out here with to debate Lord Monckton. I said, how much CO2 is in the ocean? He's a professor one of the elite professors from the university. Oh, he said, there's a lot. I said, well, how much is a lot? I said, quite a lot. I said, well, there's quite a lot. Well, how did it get there? For a start, we've got no coal-fired power stations you're blaming all the problems on, and cars and human beings for breathing, but you're eating, like all these greenie people, they're eating stuff, wearing clothes, turning lights on, getting in cars, having a hot shower, all needs energy. So I asked this bloke, now he said, I don't know, got a lot. I said, what is it, a 44-gallon drum full? Like, I'm just a lay person, and you're a professor, you're the elite of the upper echelon of intelligentsia that you've expounded to be, and could you give me the figures? Oh, it's a lot. I don't know what a lot is. And I said, well, the next trick is, Flannery told us that he couldn't answer it. He didn't know. He doesn't know how it got there neither. But what we've got to, I said, we've got to have, bearing in mind that 2/3 of the world is ocean, and we've got to have CO2 in the ocean, so when it evaporates and the water will come down, we have water to drink. So what are we drinking? It's carbon dioxide water. It's pure. But they can't answer you. It's all a figure of their imagination. And if you recall, Flannery said we're all going to go underwater. The oceans are rising, everything else. We've just had a heap of floods since the world began. None of us are underwater. Ain't that strange? So, it's a recyclable item. But the CO2 is going to wreck everything, but the same CO2 that they're saying is going to wreck everything, it can't, creates all the green and fortifies the ground so as we get food to eat. And all these greenies are going to, and all these elite that expound all this fraudulent lie, they're all doing the same. When you ask them about what about eradicating foxes and rabbits and lantana and privet and budo bush and fireweed and everything else that's deleterious to our country that's not native here, we'll get an inquiry. We'll get a committee. We'll increase the public service. Then they tax you a bit more. Tax. And that's what you've got to follow with everything they do. It's tax. The fuel excise tax. 1975, we signed the 3 worst things ever. The Lima Declaration, the World Parity Pricing of Oil, and the Family Law Court. And out of the Family Law Court, it was based on the Sexual Discrimination Act of Women. And where do they use that word discrimination? Everywhere. And the only people they discriminate against is us stokes that vote for them. Did any of them ever tell you when they go like the state parliament, we're going to sell it? They're none of the masters. They don't own it. Well, how have they got the right to sell it? We own it. We paid for it. We've got to start asking questions. And they've got to start to abide by the Constitution. Now, I don't know if you know it. We're going to have blackouts again, so history does repeat itself. In the 50s, after the war, Industry was so much in demand in Australia to supply the rest of the world to rehabilitate it under the International Monetary Fund. And the International Monetary Fund was formed 16 months before the cessation of the Second World War. You'd have thought they'd have put all their energies together to stop the mayhem and the killing. But now what we're going to do is cause a big distraction, then we've got a bank, then we'll make some money out of rehabilitating, then we can start another blue off and another war, and we can keep rotating the money. And meanwhile we'll sit in our ivory towers and send someone else off to get killed, and we'll make money out of it. So after the war, we had blackouts in Sydney. I'll tell you all the power stations. There was Balmain, Bunurong, Balmain, White Bay, Pyrmont, and there was another little one which wasn't much good. How I know about that? My father was in charge of Bunurong, one of the fellas in charge. Joe Condy was the electricity commissioner. They were steam powered, and they worked the guts out of them. Then we built the Snowy scheme that fortified our electricity. Now we come up with the ingenious idea, the elite does, we've got to have sustainable energy. Well, South Australia's a good advertisement for that. They're blackouts. And we're going to get them here too. By the way, going back to what they said, selling off our poles and wires, we're going to get cheaper electricity. Now they're saying it's going to go up by 30 or 40%. But see, they can get out of that and they say, well, we base it on it could have been 1,000 a quarter and you're only going to be paying 500 a quarter, so it's cheaper. You see, they float these lies, but the elite, when you ask them, or you go to a politician and ask them a question, they don't want to answer you. Oh, we're busy. You send them a letter, oh, we're busy. Alan Jones gets 100 letters a day and he'll answer you back in 7 days and he'll sign it. So what do these people do? We've got just educated fools running the joint. When you look at it, they go to school, do their leave school at 18, do 5 years at uni, then they go into politics. What empirical knowledge have they got? You could write on the back of a stamp in capital letters. When you think what we've achieved here, what we've done here, and the farmers what they've done, and the inventions that we've had, there's John Howard did the deal with the gas. Well, what a genius. We'll be the biggest exporter of gas next year in the world. This place is awash with oil, coal and gas. I can talk to you about how we cracked oil at Glen Davis. My mate's father was an engineer there. That's up near Lithgow, Commonwealth Oil Refineries. So John Howard signs the deal. This is the elite. And we've got to do it because I went to university and you hear them all espouse, you've got a genuflect because they've been to university.
Excuse me, John, 5 minutes.
5 minutes?
Yes.
That's my first breath. I've got a couple more breaths after that. So he sells it out. The same amount of gas Qatar sells, they get 27 billion. John Howard's illustrious deal, Australia gets 800 billion. Wouldn't keep cock eating corn. The place should be paved in gold. They're building 1,000 more steam-powered power stations, coal-fired power stations all around the world. Where do they get the coal? Here. Because we've got the best coal in the world. We've got petrochemical content coal. I'll guarantee if you go down the botanical gardens and sink a well, you'll get gas and coal. Where I live at Thelmy, there's commercial oil at Picton, Mittagong, Castle Hill, everywhere. What they mean by commercial, it's viable to drill. The Glen Davis shale seam goes nearly to the Gulf of Carpentaria. They've found 22 trillion, cop that, $22 trillion worth of shale oil strike in South Australia. We're not going to talk about that because that'll make... What they want to do is the Marxist ideology, they want to make Australia interdependent instead of independent, and we're the only country in the world that is totally self-sufficient. And we've had geniuses in the place. We've got one of the greatest farmers in the world, a bloke down in Melbourne called, in Victoria, Robert Weeroll. John Deere's supplying with machinery, the biggest farming machinery manufacturer in America, so he'll use the machinery and tell them how to improve it. They've got 200 million people, we've got 22 million, not all farmers. I can give you the facts and figures of how many farmers we've lost, but I haven't got time, but I can give it to you later. So when you come to think that we've invented the stump jump plough and we've eradicated rust in wheat, there's a tribe of things that we've done. And I've seen it all because my business took me all around the eastern states and South Australia during my business career life. And what I've seen them do, and you see how they've perfected the merino sheep. Now that comes from Spain, and they can't get the yield off the sheep what we can get here. Why? The Australian farmer's a genius, and he learned how to crossbreed it and everything else. And we've got these fools in here that we vote for. None of us ever said, hey, listen, are you going to do that? Where'd you say you're going to do that? Who gave you the right to sell that? You didn't tell us that when we voted, you? I know, but I was dreaming one night and I thought that'd be a good idea, so that's what I'm going to do. And we've got money and we're going to build a football oval. We've got the football ovals out at Homebush. We spent, I don't know how many hundreds of millions. It's going to be the be-all and end-all. Now they said it's not good enough. So we sold the land titles off, so that we could get a money stream from, and everything else we could have got a money stream from, that we could build all the infrastructure. I'll show you something. I'll just show you something. This is another trick under the guy in the government. You can see this afterwards. There's $2 billion worth of railway structure near where I live at Picton. Goes all the way down to Port Kembla. It's laying there idle. They sold, that's all I can show you. You can all have a look at the photos. I'll get a good photo, I'll find a good photo. There's a heap of them here. Have a look at that for construction. That's only, I'll show you, you can all have a look afterwards. He paid out more money in default contracts and was signing contracts up to 2 months before it finished than the completion cost of the railway. Now, if there's another railway line at Blaney, from Blaney to Demondrell, that's down near Harden. When you get to Bathurst, it takes a Y junction. One goes out to Condobolin and then to Broken Hill. The other one goes from Bathurst up to Dubbo, Burke, out that way. The one from that goes to Broken Hill, then the Broken Hill line links up with the Port Augusta line. That links up with the Transcontinental line. We build the Malden Donbarton line, and the line at Blaney to Demondrell's there needs repairing. That would link the whole of Australia from Western Australia to the east coast, and by the way, Port Kembla is the deepest harbour in the east coast, and that's where we should be exporting our wheat. See, a lot of the farmers in New South Wales got to export their stuff to South Australia and Victoria because we haven't got the facilities here. But these blokes here, we're going to build a football oval. Don't worry about the record crop we've got. There's 14 million tonne of grain going to go out the southern ports of Western Australia. 14 million tonne. There's no country in the world can grow rural produce like we can. And when that's going, the whole of Australia gets a spin-off from it. But what we've done, I'll just show you something else. There's 5,000 agreements and treaties there. 5,000. You can't get them. They're hard copies. The federal government stopped you getting them. They don't want to let out. There's no GATS in that. That's the General Agreement on Trade and Services. No Agenda 21 in that. That's there. There's no General Agreement on Trade and Services. Who gave them the right to do that? Sold out our future for our children, our grandchildren, everything else. We had the greatest Cockatoo Island, the Everleigh Workshops, where the greatest tradesmen in the world came out of. The Yanks used to say, send everything to Australia and get it repaired. They'll make a machine gun out of coat hanger. By the way, there's the old machine gun, worked underwater. The Yanks couldn't believe it. It's like the blokes, the Utah mine that come out from America and said, we're the greatest tunnellers and everything in the world, and these brothers blew them away. There's no... I can't stop, Jim, because I took another breath. I've got to stop. I'll have to stop, but I'll answer any questions later and I'll show you all these photographs. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Great stuff. Okay.
Where do I put this back together?
No problem. Okay, well now, we thank you very much, John Macrae. It's tremendous. Now we're going to have our third speaker in the lineup. This is Dr. Shawn Turnbull. He is a prolific author on reforming the theories and practices of capitalism. He authored in 1975 Democratizing the Wealth of Nations, and in 2002 A New Way to Govern Organizations and Society After the Enron collapse. This United Kingdom public policy booklet and his essay published by the OECD earlier this year on well-being and opportunities provide the basis for his presentation this evening. I'd like you to welcome Dr. Shawn Turnbull, please.
Thank you, David, and thanks for everybody being here this evening. I've been fascinated by the passion and anger of the previous speakers, and I'll have a different tone. I see my role here. I don't understand the title of this evening's discussion. I don't know if I'm a patriot or an elite, or well, I think I'm neither, and you can judge for yourself by my presentation, because everybody seems to define it in different ways. I see my purpose here tonight as providing how to create a better world, how to create well-being. There's no use being angry. I get grumpy, but our previous speakers are angry, but I'm not clear of what they are speaking for. And that's what I want to address. And what I see them as being frustrated and angry about is being the people, feel exploited, they feel alienated, they feel that they don't have a say, they feel there's privileged people that don't understand what's going on in the world. So it's a matter of how democracy, the architecture of democracy, that's what I want to talk about, the architecture of democracy. In other words, how is power exercised today, and how would we like it to be exercised? And the take-home message I want to leave with you tonight, that I'm a bottom-up person. I believe that power comes from the people, and democracy, you need a highly dense democracy from the bottom up, and we mainly got it from the top down. So we're being exploited by hierarchies. If you see how modern society, not primitive societies, but modern societies, we have institutions in the public, private and non-profit sectors, they all command and control hierarchies, just like an army. And hierarchies introduce asymmetries of power, privilege and prestige. They also introduce dysfunctional subservience, blind obedience, alienation and conformity. All of these things are not healthy. What is the alternative? It's not taught. We've lost our native common sense of how early societies were organised and how all biota are organised. Modern humans are the only social animals in the globe that try to manage complexity with command and control hierarchies. Ants and bees, whole crowds of them, thousands of them, without any command and control, decide where to build their homes, how to design them, how to construct them, how to maintain them. Herds of birds and swarms of fish do the same thing. It's collective decision making from the bottom up. But this is not taught at any university in the world. I made one sociologist very angry who was a keynote speaker at a Chicago conference on society advancement of socioeconomics. I said, why don't you lawyers teach people how to write democratic constitutions, not just for companies, but for governments and social organisations? And I thought, I gave her a hard time over dinner. I happened to find sitting next to her. And I thought that was the end of that. And a year later, I got an email from her saying, I've been on sabbatical for the last year, and I've designed the course that you want. And it's now, you can now download it and see an introduction. And my 18-minute video lecture of that course, which is on the web, talks to the paper that I was commissioned to write for the New Economics Foundation in London in 2002. The reason they commissioned me to write it, it's called A New Way to Govern, Organisations and Society After Enron, was because the Thatcher privatisation, which we hear a lot of anger about, privatisation, people didn't like privatisation. It was beginning not to work. There were problems with Welsh water and the trains and so on. And they know they didn't want to go back to command and control hierarchies in the public sector. And they found that the private sector was just as bad. So I'm very sympathetic to a lot of the anger and frustrations and marvellous stories that I've heard from the earlier speakers, and I find that I'm very much in their camp, but in a different way, that I'd go down to the bottom and come up, and let's see why that's a way to make a better place. Now, in February this year, I was at a 2-day workshop in Paris with the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, in Paris. And the chief statistician there convened the organisation the workshop, because she's concerned with that gross national product figures, monetary figures, didn't further well-being. A lot of economic activities destroys happiness and well-being. You can have floods and destruction, sickness and wars that all increase GDP. We hear about jobs and growth, but we don't want growth anymore. What we want is lifestyle satisfactions. And the best people to do that are people at the bottom, not people at the top. And so you need a system of decision-making where it's bottom-up. And there are examples of this, and it's all self-taught. I think you've probably all heard of Visa International, for instance. Visa International was the founding chief executive officer was a gentleman called D. Hock. And Visa International was a way for all the banks to cooperate, but also to compete. It's allowed people to be cooperative and competitive. And he said, and it has hundreds of boards of directors under one corporate body. And he coined a new name to describe this architecture of power, where there's division of power and checks and balances. Now, most of you know what power does. Does anybody like to tell me, remind me? It corrupts.
Ultimately.
And what does absolute power do?
Corrupts absolutely.
Corrupts absolutely. Right. 10 of the right. We all agree about that. And that's why people are angry about being exploited. Our first speaker and second speaker. What is the solution to solving the corruption of power?
Anarchy.
No. No, not anarchy. It's a division of power. You've got to create a division of power to get checks and balances. And company directors, being at a non-profit organisation or government department, companies have absolute power to identify and manage their own conflicts of interest. So they have absolute power to corrupt themselves, the organisation, and society. And so what we need to do is, this corporate constitutions of any organisation we've got to have lawyers and people that instruct those lawyers to say, no, we don't want to make decision that way. We want to do it like they do at Visa International, where there's hundreds of boards, where one board keeps a check on the other. There's a couple of very successful multinational corporations, well, not multinationally necessarily, but one in London called the John Lewis Partnership. It's a big supermarket food chain. It's one of the biggest in England, but it's owned and controlled by the employees. And they have dozens of boards, all having independence to manage at the micro level what suits their local community best. In Spain, in the Basque area of Spain, which has been trying to be independent of the central government for years, in the 1950s, a one-eyed Spanish Catholic priest wanted to create work for his flock, and so he put the till out, the collection till out, and raised money. And today, the Mondragon worker cooperatives or stakeholder-owned cooperatives employ 80,000 people. So it's managed from the bottom up, not the top down. And it's not just workers; it's the customers and suppliers and anybody that's involved with the firm. And that sort of architecture I call network governance. It's having networks of division of power and checks and balances. And that's how you find in Biota has network governance. The idea of using markets to allocate real resources is a nonsense when prices are determined by money which can't be defined in anything real. So the market ideology of organising society it means that if you believe that a social construct not related to reality can allocate real things, it means either you're mad or it's your religion. Take your pick. Sorry, does that mean a warning bell? Oh, division. I thought I was dividing up. Okay.
Not required.
Not required. I'm talking about division of power. No. So, am I an elite or am I a patriot? I don't know. I have to make an embarrassing admission that under the definition of your definition, I think the definition of both of you about politicians being the elite, that I'm the son of one. And he exercised his power in all sorts, in new ways, in a very fascist way, which was very embarrassing for me to say, because I believe in bottom up. He did three things because of the family circumstances. One was I had rotten teeth when I grew up in a little town called Launceston. So as mayor of the town, he decided to fluoride the water. First place in Australia, I think in the world, that had fluoridised water. Everybody said it'd do all sorts of poisonous things. And when the engineer was about to put the fluoride in the water back in the 40s, I think it was, the chief engineer said, "Your worship, I've got an embarrassing problem. The metering system's not working." My father said, "Don't tell anybody." And of course in the press there were letters and everything saying, "Oh, it's dreadful, we're being poisoned with fluoride." But now it's become acceptable. My mother had to have a lung removed because of TB. So in a fascist way, he introduced the first place in the world to introduce compulsory x-rays. Awful top-down sort of stuff. But now they got rid of all tuberculosis in Tasmania. And rumour has it they filled up the sanitariums with mentally deficients, but that's only hearsay. And so I don't know where I stand in this, so I'm not following my father's footsteps in that way. He ended up in the Australian Senate with a balance of power with his old schoolmate, a fellow called Harry Holt. So he used to give him a hard time. In fact, Harry Holt gave the speech at my brother's wedding, and he told the audience like this, this young Turnbull wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for me. And all the ladies sort of giggled, thinking that my mother had got up to all sorts of tricks with him, but the answer was he introduced my parents. So that's why I'm here today, because of Harry Holt. Anyway, let's just give you, I'm trying to lead some family relationships like the other speakers, but I want to get into seriously of how to get well-being. Now, the OECD are now starting to measure well-being, and they've got 9 different factors that they look at, and only 3 of those are material conditions like work and having your own home and having a job. All the rest are quality of life things. And to get quality of life, you can't get it in a command and control hierarchy because of power exploits people. And what you need is a distributed power of checks and balances, and the DNA in our heritage and all social biota hardwires every individual of us here to be contrary. We can be trusting and we can be suspicious. We can be selfish and we can be generous. We can be cooperative and we can be competitive. As soon as you get network and distribution of power, your natural instincts to be contrary are allowed to emerge. They create checks and balances in society, which we now don't get because of conformity of doing what you're told, and if you blow the whistle, it jeopardizes your job and your creation, your promotion. So this whole idea of having network governance needs different types of constitutions than we've got throughout our social organisations. And this is a vision that I have for the future, and I call it ecological governance, because this is how nature is organised. And there's 2 ways of managing complexity. The reason why a manager appoints sub-managers and limits the amount of people reporting to him to a handful is because of information overload. He can't manage all the details. And then each of those sub-managers appoints sub-sub-managers. And you get these organisation charts or pyramids, and information comes up about 4 or 5 levels, and each time it comes up a different level, it's like playing that party game of telephone, where if you try to transmit a message through 4 or 5 people with all the best intentions, it'll get distorted, biased, and there'll be gaps. And this is how we try to manage, but in power hierarchies, there's an incentive not to report bad news. So you don't learn about the mistakes, the screw-ups, and what could destroy the organisation you're working in. So hierarchies manage complexity incompletely. with incomplete knowledge going to the decision makers. The other way of managing complexity comprehensively is having a network where everybody's involved. All those little ants and bees going around reporting back of what where the honey is and so on. It's a collective decision making. And then you have the checks and balances built in. And this is how the cooperatives in Spain and the John Lewis Partnership and the Visa International, which are huge 80,000 employee companies, operate. John Lewis, for example, you're allowed to have anonymous, you're allowed to criticise your managers. In fact, you can do it anonymously in the weekly newsletter. It's a way of institutionalising whistleblowing and blowing the whistle on all those things that our first speaker wanted juries to do. They have internal juries within the organisations. And nowadays we don't really have democracy because we've been colonised by the imperialism of the centralised power of social organisations in the various sectors. What I'm talking about is reforming, enriching democracy from the bottom up. So that's my vision of the future called ecological governance. And you can find my paper on the web, just Google my name, Well-Being Opportunities, and my name, Shawn Turnbull. You can find my book is on the web also, Democratising Wealth of Nations in 1975. How ignorant some of the elites are. The guy that read it, Professor Colin, it'll come to me. He designed the GDP figures for England in the 1930s. And he read my book and he said, Shawn, it's not about economics. And I sort of thought, how can it be not about economics? Because he defined wealth as income. GDP is about income. As a business person, I define wealth as assets less liabilities. It's just obvious to me. So economists and business people are just talking through each other. They live in different planets. And this is why the elites can be very dangerous, because their language denies them the language and concepts to understand how real people operate. So with those warnings, I'd like to see that people, if they're angry, that we try to teach people a new way to govern from the bottom up, and we have built-in checks and balances so we can all further the well-being of everybody as individuals, the organisations and the communities and society. Thank you very much.
Now our fourth and last speaker, and I must apologise to our last speaker for his name not being on the programme. This was because of internet problems we had at our internet site, so I won't go into details about that, except my apologies. Mr. Julian McKinley King is a geologist, ecologist, anthropologist, associated with the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney. He's worked as a resource geologist in Australia, Asia, Pacific and Africa, and he's a PhD research on United Nations in East Timor, and advocate for social ecology. I'd like you to welcome Julian McKinley King, please.
Thank you, David. Good evening, everybody. I'm afraid I must apologise. I've only had a couple of days' notice with this, and I've written a lot of pages here, but after hearing the other three speakers, I feel like I'm talking to the converted, and I probably don't need to go through a lot of what's here. But I will just go through the notes roughly and try and talk off the cuff. It's a lot more interesting than reading out a paper. Interestingly, talking about Shawn's discussion about Mondragon in Spain, in the Pyrenees. I went there 20 odd years ago. I'd seen it on TV on ABC called the Mondragon Experiment. So I was fascinated when I grew up to go and have a look, and it is indeed an incredible model. And we're not learning about these things in Australia or in the West. We're only seeing our own top-down approach. But all over the world, from the Zapatistas in Mexico, the Mondragon in the Pyrenees, the Kurdish women's movement in Syria after getting their homelands back from ISIS, are setting up incredible cooperatives. And the one in Mondragon, for example, I was fortunate to spend several weeks there. And while I'll get on to my talk in a minute, I think it's interesting to say a few words. I got in there 10 o'clock at night on a motorcycle in the pouring rain. I walked into a pub. Nobody spoke English. But soon I was surrounded by a group of people, and one that did speak English, and they were just amazed. They'd never had someone come and visit them from Australia or really anywhere. But they started off in the 40s, 5 people in a small workshop with money from the village, and they started building cooking utensils, pots and pans and knives and forks for their local family and their community members. And when I was there in 1990, they were 120,000 people, building motor cars, washing machines, computers, everything you can imagine. And it just grew and grew and grew. And how the system works roughly, they get their basic wage every fortnight, and then at the end of the year, they get their profit